All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first class of 6 on Beyond Death. I hope you are as excited as I am to be here. I'm excited to teach this course. I have had more questions on this topic in the last year than I would say in the last 10 years. I'm not going to speculate as to why, but people are obviously interested. I want to thank Carol Weir. Carol, give a wave. Thank you, Carol, for being my chavruta on this topic for the last few months. So Carol will be joining us and is the resident expert after me. Is that okay, Carol? I also want to thank Ronly Doron, who works in the office, my assistant, who is our source sheet builder. So I give her what to put on and she does. And Carol, you're on mute. So if you want to talk, a reminder. And finally, and my thank yous, I want to thank Neil Gilman, who was my teacher, my professor at the seminary, a nice Quebec City-born Jew. He passed away in 2017, and he is the author of The Death of Death, which you could sort of see with the virtual background. This has been my primary guide as I have delved into this topic, getting ready for this course. And in a lot of ways, by studying his words, we're actually giving him a certain life beyond death. So I actually find it to be quite fitting. A couple notes about Zoom etiquette. One, and I think you're all doing this, please do have your full name on the screen for everyone to see. Don't have like Jay's iPad. Just it'd be really nice for everyone to see your actual name. And if at all possible, and for most of you that seems to be, please do have your videos on because I like to see everyone's face. It makes a big difference, and I want you to see each other's faces. So that's the first piece. I'm now going to divide you into 3 groups, okay? And first, I need one person in each group to consider themselves the group recorder. This is not a major job, but please take it seriously. And you're going to take just a couple notes, just remembering what people said. And there are a couple of questions which I want your group to begin addressing. You'll have a few minutes. After introducing yourself, I wanted to answer as a group, why are you taking this class? Which is another way of saying, what do you want to walk away with from this class? Okay. And secondly, and a very different kind of question, is there something called a soul? And if so, what is its relationship to the body? Okay, so get a recorder, someone to take a couple notes, introduce yourselves, and everyone can answer why you're taking this class, what do you want to get out of it? And do you individually think that there's something called a soul? And if so, what is its relationship to the body? All right, we're going to go into breakout groups now, and you have a few minutes. I'll drop in at all of them.
David?
Please join your group.
Thank you. It's funny that this topic came up because the gentleman I walk with every day, we were discussing the possibility of an afterlife as it applies to Judaism. So it's appropriate that you're talking about this.
Great. All right, your room is awaiting you. So you have to click on the join.
Oh, sorry.
There you go. Hi, Sid. I hope you can hear me. We just went into breakout rooms. So I'm going to try to assign you to one. There we go. Okay, so you should have now got to have an invitation to join room 2, and they'll give you the instructions.
I don't know how you, I'm not sure how you.
All right.
I guess points.
Yeah, that's all we need.
Yeah.
Where do you type it?
You don't type, I guess you'd write it on a
Oh,
piece
just
of paper.
write it Are we supposed to talk or listen? You're muted, Rabbi.
People have another few seconds to come back in, so. you can
That's
check.
fine. I
Have
can
you
talk to
started?
myself. It's been done before.
Have you started the course yet, Rabbi?
Yeah, so there are 3 people waiting to come in. We're coming back now for some breakout rooms, and we'll continue from there. So welcome to the 3 of you who are just joining us right now.
Okay.
All right, I believe we are all back. So I'm going to ask a participant from group number 1, whoever the recorder was, to please unmute yourself and share with us consensus why people are taking this course and thoughts about the soul and the body. Group number 1.
Okay, so I was the recorder. And the consensus is that we're all taking it because, well, we're interested in the subject and we all need something to do during our days at home. So we found it interesting and decided to take the course. As far as belief in the soul, I think is a bit of a split. A few of us tending towards not believing that the soul, that there's an existence of a soul. Others are saying that, okay, there's a soul while you're alive, but what happens to your soul afterwards, we're not particularly certain about. So that's from group number 1.
All right, thank you, Alan. Group number 2. Whoever the leader is, please unmute yourself.
I was one of the questions. I was recorded for one of the questions.
Okay, so Alan, which question?
For all 5 of them. For number 1. What was the first question?
So why are people taking the class, Alan?
I was recording for that one.
Okay, so why are people taking the class in your group?
I want to learn about the topic.
Well, great. Okay, thank you. And is there someone in group number 2 who answered for the other question about the soul and the body? If so, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, that was me, and we had a consensus that we just weren't sure. That was the consensus.
Great. Okay. So uncertainty is going to be a theme of ours. And finally, group number 3.
We found it an intriguing topic and a lot of questions we want to know about. Carol's reading the book and a lot of us, well, all of us lost somebody. So we wanted to know more about the soul.
Okay.
And
thank you, Lisa. So for my end, I have 3 purposes that I'd like to accomplish in this class. The first is, and I think Lisa just mentioned it, that I'm hoping that course will help guide you in your own questioning about what happens after death. And in that sense, the class is very personal. Whether we're thinking about ourselves, as I heard a couple of people comment, or thinking about a loved one who has already passed away, this could be a very personal class. Secondly, I want to show you the development of an idea through Jewish time. And in that sense, it is an intellectual class. We start with seeds, kernels in the Torah, and we see an idea develop and blossom over time, over countries, across continents. And finally, and this is a goal of every class that we have, a desire to create community for the learners and members of Adath Israel. In that sense, this class is an opportunity for relationship. So what do I mean by beyond death? Everything. Our sources talk about where we go when we die, what happens to us metaphysically when we die, talks about future resurrection. Our sources talk about a messianic era and end of days. And all these are sort of lumped together in the beyond death category. Sometimes these seem to be discrete units, and sometimes, depending on the author, they seem to overlap one with another. You know, there is a quote from Goodfellas. Anyone seen the movie? A couple people. So someone says, "I'm from Miami. You ever been there?" It says, "It's like you died and woke up in Jew heaven." This is where you laugh, but you're on mute. Okay. That is as valid a source in some ways as almost anything else in terms of what comes next. It's Miami. That is to say, no one has ever, according to Jewish belief, died and really come back to tell us what happens when we go. And so this, when we talk about belief, this is really at the middle of that. That is to say, it is what you believe. This is not something which we can prove. It is not something which is, I would say, certainly early on in Jewish history, fundamental to being a Jew, but rather it's a little bit more open-ended. And I want us to take that approach to it. And certainly we are 21 people here. We're going to have 21, if not more, opinions, and that's really okay for this kind of thing. So I'm going to pull up our source sheet now, and I'm going to read for you a parable. Can we all see this? Make it a bit bigger.
Yeah, there it is.
Great. Imagine twins growing peacefully in the warmth of the womb. Their mouths are closed and they're being fed via the navel. Their lives are serene. The whole world to these brothers is the interior of the womb. Who could conceive anything larger, better, more comfortable? They begin to wonder. We are getting lower and lower. Surely, if it continues, we'll exit one day. What will happen after we exit? Now, the first infant is a believer. He is heir to a religious tradition which tells him that there will be a new life after this wet and warm existence of the womb. A strange belief seemingly without foundation, but one to which he holds fast. The second infant is a thoroughgoing skeptic. Mere stories do not deceive him. He believes only in that which can be demonstrated. He is enlightened and tolerates no idle conjecture. What is not within one's experience can have no basis in one's imagination. Says the faithful brother, after our death here, there'll be a new and great world. We will eat through the mouth. We will see great distances, and we will hear through the ears on the sides of our heads. Why our feet will be straightened and our heads will be up and free rather than down and boxed in. Replies the skeptic, nonsense. You are straining your imagination again. There is no foundation for this belief. There's only your survival instinct, an elaborate defense mechanism, a historically conditioned subterfuge. You are looking for something to calm your fear of death. There is only this world. There is no world to come. Well, then, asks the first, what do you say it'll be like? The second brother snappily replies with all the assurance of the slightly knowledgeable. We will go with a bang. Our world will collapse and we'll sink into oblivion. No more, nothing, black void, an empty consciousness, forgotten. This may not be a comforting thought, but it is a logical one. Suddenly the water inside the womb bursts. The womb convulses, upheaval, turmoil, writhing, everything lets loose. Then a mysterious pounding, a crushing staccato pounding, faster, faster, lower, lower. The believing brother exits. Tearing himself from the womb, he falls outward. The second brother shrieks, startled by the accident befallen his brother. He bewails and bemoans the tragedy, the death of a perfectly fine fellow. Why didn't he take better care? Why did he fall into that terrible abyss? As he laments, he hears a head-splitting cry and a great tumult from the black abyss. He trembles, oh my, what a horrible end, as I predicted. Meanwhile, as the skeptic brother mourns, his dead brother has been born into the new world. The head-splitting cry is a sign of health and vigor, and the tumult is really a chorus of muzzle tones, sounded by the waiting family thanking God for the birth of a healthy son. Indeed, in the words of a contemporary thinker, man comes from darkness of the not yet and proceeds the darkness of the no more. While it's difficult to imagine the not yet, it's more difficult to picture the no more. So my first question to you is, who has seen that before? Who has heard that parable before? And if so, where do you think it comes from? No one? Okay. So that is the parable. There comes the very end or the very beginning of Maurice Lamb's book, The Jewish Way in Death and Dying, which is probably, after the Bible, quite possibly the most read Jewish book of all time, certainly in the last 20 years. He actually didn't write it. It comes from Yechiel Michal Tukachinsky, who was born 1871 and died in 1955. It, I think, opens up the possibility for us of what could be, and two different modalities of thinking. You could either be the skeptic or you could be the believer. And either one is part of it. This story obviously points towards something to come, but what that thing is, really, we don't know. What happens next is a mystery. There really are no wrong answers. I want to repeat that. But I think that all of this that we're about to encounter points to some sort of need to believe, or something inherent within us that does believe. And whether that is because we're Jews or because we are simply human, this is certainly a question which I think our earliest ancestors were asking of themselves. What happens next? And so what I like to do now is go through our source sheet. Don't be discouraged by its length. I promise we're actually going to get through a good chunk of it today. And then we'll go from there. As I go through the sources, certainly if anything becomes unclear, please unmute yourself, jump in. There is some time for discussion as we go. I'll ask a couple questions certainly as we go. I'm going to do more lecturing this week than I intend to for the future sessions, but I want to lay a base for where we're going to go from here. Okay? Any questions on any of that? You ready to go? All right. Now, you don't see me, you see the screen still, don't you? Okay, here we go. We all see this? Can someone say yes? Unmute yourself and say yes to make sure I know.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So a few sources on death in the Bible. The Bible is full of people dying. Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe old age, old and content, and was gathered to his kin. When he breathed his last and died, he was gathered to his kin in a ripe old age and was buried by his sons, Esav and Yaakov. When Jacob finished his instructions to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed and breathing his last, he was gathered to his people. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the God. Buried him in the valley of Moab near Beit Peor. No one knows where he's buried. He was 120. His eyes were undimmed, his vigor unabated. And the Israelites mourned for him 30 days. Okay. So my question for you at this point is, according to those sources, what happens when we die?
We're gathered to our kin.
Okay, what does that mean?
Hard to know, but our souls, or some part of us, joins our forebearers in some unknown area of the universe, and we are together again.
Okay. Thank you, Mom. Anyone else?
I didn't take it quite, at that point that it was the burial, but more that the family came together to be with this person who had died and would now go through the steps of actually burying the person.
Okay, so these are our Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is Moshe. If we're going to learn something about death, hopefully we can learn it from them. Stephen Greed.
Yes. Hopefully it's not what is described in Eov.
Do you want to expand on that?
Well, they dissuade, they're trying to convince Eov to abandon his trust and belief in Hashem, and the two that are arguing with him, I think it's the two friends, telling him, what is there to life after life? All you're going to do is go down into the ground and be with the worms, something like that, right? It's very, it is not on an upbeat, it's very negative as
Okay,
to
so
that there is an afterlife even.
so we're gonna look at some sources from from Job today actually, and I want to comment on. So my mom picked up on this idea of being gathered unto your kin. It's a phrase we see more than once in the Torah. It's generally understood to be a phrase which means you are put into the family plot, right? You're literally gathered with the people who came before you because they're buried in this cave and you're buried in that cave alongside them. I think that there is room there to imagine it as we heard, as my mom suggested, but that's not the way certainly academic readers of the Bible imagine it. But surprisingly or not, hold on one second, Giti, surprisingly or not, none of these sources really, they sort of say they died, and there doesn't even seem to be much curiosity as to what happens with them when they die. Like Moshe he doesn't die and then have a conversation with God, right? He dies. The people mourn and they move on. Giti, unmute. Giti, you have to unmute. There we go.
Thank you. I took it to mean kin in a broader picture as, first of all, it gave me a little bit of hope. And I took kin to mean not just your family, but for me, it would be amongst the Jewish people.
Okay.
So it would be broader than just my family.
Okay.
Hi.
Harry, and then Sophie.
If this is directed to the people that are left, I think it's the natural tendency would be fear, and this is to allay your fears. You will be gathered to your kin. You're not going to be alone.
Okay, thank you, Barry. Sophie?
Oh, who's first?
Sophie, it's your turn.
Oh, okay. I felt it was more like a collective soul that we're gathered together. All the souls are gathered together.
Okay, so you are all engaging, I think, which is a very Jewish practice, in midrash, reading into the text. I think you're probably reading it beyond the pshat, the contextual meaning, and that's okay. That's what all of our sources do. For me, at least, these sources, perhaps surprisingly, don't give us a lot of information. They die, and that's it. But there's actually more sources that talk beyond that. So we're going to go back to our source sheet. And now, okay. We have a few sources, two sources which talk about death not quite being the end. One, with Enoch says he walked with God, then he was no more, for God took him. And from this, we have all sorts of literature, the idea that Enoch doesn't die. He just lives forever. And then the notion of a fiery chariot coming and picking up Elijah, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Okay, so these are our two people in Tanakh who the Torah doesn't, or the Tanakh doesn't say that they die. Something else happens. And one thing we didn't talk about, maybe we'll chance later, what is the purpose, what is the value of death? It's an interesting question that I think will be part of your homework, because we're talking about the homework later. So if the first few sources that I shared don't go into you don't accept it as really talking about the finality of death, that there's nothing afterwards. The next few sources are going to really play into that. These sources are largely from Nach rather than the Tag, so they're later than the Torah, but part of our scripture nevertheless. So a lot of it's from Psalms. So the psalmist writes, "In time of trouble, why should I fear the encompassing evil of those who supplant me? Men who trust in their riches, who glory in their wealth. God cannot redeem a man or pay his ransom to God. The price of life is too high, and so one ceases to be forever. Shall he live eternally and never see the grave? For one sees that the wise die, that the foolish and ignorant both perish, leaving their wealth to others. Their grave is the eternal home. I'm going to repeat that again. Their grave is their eternal home, the dwelling place for all generations of those once famous on earth. Man does not abide in honor. He is like the beasts that perish. Okay. So, and when I want to pull you up again just from that one. Anyone recognize that psalm? Barry, where's it from?
That's the psalm that we recite at the end of services at the house of mourning.
Yes. So that's a traditional psalm going back many, many centuries that we recite at a shiva. What does this psalm tell us about death? Anyone?
Comes to
Just
everybody.
jump in.
Death is final.
Death is final, and it happens to everybody.
Yeah,
Everybody
everybody
dies.
dies.
Everybody dies. And for me, it seems to say, there is nothing beyond that. We go to the grave. And that's it. And I've been questions in the past, why is this the thing we read at a shiva? Right? And it seems to be that it's telling those who are there, like, now is the time with death in front of you to remember to focus on living. That we shouldn't be, we don't need to be comforted by what happens next. Rather, this is the moment to remind ourselves to live a life with meaning. Certainly historically, compared to other religions, Judaism has been much less focused on what comes next than what we do with this life. We're much more on deed over creed. And I think that's why we read this psalm at House of Mourning. I'll go on. Psalm 146, I'll praise the Lord all my life. Sing hymns to my God while I exist. Do not your trust in the mortal man who cannot save. Why? Teitzerucho, yashuv ladmato. His breath departs, he returns to dust. On that day, his plans come to nothing. Okay, so what happens to people? They die. The only thing that you can rely on is God. Next psalm, this is in Hallel. It's one of my favorite lines in some ways. Lo hametim yahallelujah v'lo kol yerdei duma. The dead cannot praise the Lord, nor can those who go down into silence. This idea of going down is going to come up again. But we bless the Lord now and forever. Right? So once it's over, it's over. There's no way to even praise God, which you would think would be the one thing perhaps we could do. If God created us, God would want to praise when we're gone. But according to Psalms, that is actually not the case. Once you're gone, we are gone. And the question then comes up, where do the dead go? And we certainly know historically, mostly Jews buried their dead. So they go into the earth. There is some history to Jewish cremation, but it's very old and didn't continue for too long. For another time. Certainly for our ancient ancestors, think around the year 0. People were buried, as I mentioned, in family plots or family grave areas. Let's say a cave. Their body would be given a year or so to decompose, and then their bones would be collected and put where the other bones were. Or if you remember when a certain ossuary where they thought Jesus was placed in made their rounds around the museums, their bones may have been put in some sort of ossuary like that if they merited it, so to speak. But generally their body disappeared over the course of a year, because that's how long it took, in a sort of dry climate, and then the bones would be collected unto their kin, so to speak. So, but we still ask ourselves, where do people go? And there's a story of Chizkiyahu, of King Hezekiah, who gets sick and he wants another 15 years of life. And what happens? He is granted that. And at the end, when he recovers from his illness, he says, I thought I must depart in the middle of my days. I've been consigned to the gates of Sheol for the rest of my years. Hold on one moment. If you're going to play that, you have to have your things on. Okay, Jacob? I'm teaching right now.
Where are they?
Right over here.
Oh.
we have a guest. Like I said, home early from school today. So in this source, we have King Hezekiah talk about going down to the gates of Sheol after he dies, and that's where he's going to be forever. He goes to this place called Sheol. And Proverbs Mishlei also talks about that. Sheol and Abaddon cannot be satisfied, nor can the eyes of man be satisfied. That is, they're always going to be taking. Job, which we mentioned earlier, if I must look forward to Sheol as my home and make my bed in the dark place, say to the pit. So this idea of down, right, downwards pit. You are my father. This idea of maggots. And going down, shall we go down together to the dust? This was going across different books of the Bible. The language is the same. That is down to Sheol. That is the place where we go.
Rabbi, that's
Yep.
where the body goes, right? And the soul, isn't there a sense of going up?
So in most of Tanakh, it's not all Tanakh, there is no differentiation between body and soul. That is to say, it doesn't talk about a soul. We're actually going to get to that in a second. It's language which doesn't exist in Tanakh. There is one unified whole. It's only later on with the influence of Greek thought that we start having these two dual units, the body, the physical, and the soul, the spiritual. I opted not to do a whole thing on the creation of humankind, the first couple chapters, the language there. But if you'll note, right here in front of you, I bolded nafsho. We're going to do a closer dive in a couple minutes. There are words, nefesh and ruach and neshama, which come up. And those may be words, particularly neshama, which you've heard used to talk about what we would consider soul. Those words, sorry, was someone talking to me? Nope, okay. Those words in Tanakh don't mean what we mean by them. That is, and even the translation here doesn't really account for it. It's more like life breath, right? It's the spark in us that gives us the ability to live, which is breathing. It's not a separate entity like we would consider a soul to be, okay? Okay, so we see more of that. We have more idea of, do you work wonders for the dead? The shades rise to praise you. These are questions which are meant not to be answered in the affirmative. Where do people go? They go down. Isaiah, so we're into prophets. For it is not Sheol that praises you, the death does not extol you, right? Nor do we who descend from the pit hope for your grace. It's a very tough line. Those who die do not hope for God's grace because it's over. And like I said at the beginning, please don't be discouraged by today's class. Okay? If all you take is don't be discouraged, that's fine. Because from the kernels we're going to see, this opens up. Job again, my days are few. Leave me alone before I depart, never to return for the land of deepest gloom. As a cloud fades away, so whoever goes down to Sheol does not come up. Returns no more to his home. His place does not know him. Okay, we have another one. This is from Bereshit, which is the only one here I have from Torah, about Jacob. And he says, you're going to send my white hand dead to Sheol in grief. Okay. So, do we have any reactions to that? Any big smiles?
No.
I think it's kind of.
I was under the impression like the Messiah's coming and we're all going to be together again.
Sorry, say it again, Lisa.
About the Messiah coming, you know, I thought that's a Jewish belief that the Messiah comes and we're all going to be brought back to life and we're all going to be together with our families again.
So you thought it was a Jewish belief, and yet none of those sources seem to indicate any of that. Is that what you're saying? Okay. Anyone else?
I found it
Rabbi.
depressing.
Eileen first. Yep.
It's what we've read so far sort of begs the question that you first gave to us was, do you think there's a soul? What's this is saying? It's final. That's it. You go down. No mention of soul.
Yeah. Anyone else? I know someone was trying to talk at the beginning.
Yeah, I was going to say similar to Eileen, but I just found this very depressing.
Yeah, certainly for those of us who are comforted or want to be comforted by the idea of something coming next, a short reading of almost all of, if not all of our primary, our Tanakh sources, right, our earliest strata of Jewish texts, right, the Tanakh, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, from what we're seeing, really has no indication that there is a separate thing called a soul, or that there is any type of life beyond death. That it is the end. However you want to imagine that, you can imagine it, but key term being end. Stephen.
Well, is it a midrash or is it in the final chapters of the final book when Moshe is dying, about to die, that he has an argument with God?
So there,
yes,
all midrash. There's beautiful midrash about Moshe arguing with God about death. I mean, there's a little in the Torah for sure, but there's beautiful midrash on it. He doesn't want to die, and actually, it's a wonderful thing to learn with someone who is dying about those different emotions that you might be going through, because Moshe seems to go through all of them. But even there, which we saw from the first section, the end is the end. Okay. And not only is the end, there actually is a sense that there's something fairly negative, if you want to take it that way, about death. That is to say, Sid, were you trying to say something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
They keep, in the previous section, they kept referring to Shoel. Shoel is hell, I think.
Yeah, it's a Sheol.
So everybody's going to hell. There's no heaven. Is that what you're condemned to? And therefore there is a, call it soul.
So I'm not sure I would at this point talk about Sheol as being hell, and there doesn't seem to be really negative connotations there either. It's just, it's somewhere going, it's over. It certainly doesn't talk about, we'll imagine perhaps from Christian thought, fires and burning and that kind of thing, or needing to go through a stage of purification in order to get somewhere else. Rather, it's geographical, and it's just the end. At least that's my read on it, and you're certainly welcome to read it differently. Okay, so not only do we have this idea of death and end and going down to Sheol, there's also the idea we see throughout Torah that with death comes impurity. That is, there's something negative about it, that we want to keep ourselves far from it. And if we do encounter it, that we become tameh, we become impure, unclean, however you want to understand that language. So Vayikra, Leviticus has that in terms of coming to contact with dead animals, but also with human beings. In Numbers, he who touches the corpse of a human being shall be unclean for 7 days. Obviously, today we deal with this differently. What it might mean to be tameh or tahor, it's functionally different than it was, let's say, at a time when there was a Beit HaMikdash, when there was a temple. But definitely our Torah is against being impure, or recognizing that there is impurity in the world, and that is not a state that we forever want to be in. Okay. There are certain verses in our tradition which can be pointed to is saying, but what about this one? Why can't we say from these verses that there is something afterwards? So I want to just present a few of them right now, because you might encounter them if this is something that you are interested in. So from Psalms again, I extol you, O Lord, for you have lifted me up and not let my enemies rejoice over me. O Lord, my God, I cried out to you and you healed me. O Lord, you brought me up from Sheol, preserve me from going down into the pit. So here we have some language indicating going down into Sheol and being brought up. Do you take this as God actually bringing someone up from Sheol? Anyone?
Not literally, no. Well, I take it more as perhaps somebody who is very depressed and feels that they are in Sheol, but still living, and God has raised their spirits so that they don't feel that they are in Sheol any longer.
Thank you. Anybody else?
He said that and God healed me, or God, so that's, I would take from that the person didn't necessarily die, that he was ill, but God did heal him, so that there is some hope.
Yeah, so the way I read it, certainly that there is hope that we can turn to God, and I'm just looking for the document again, that we can turn to God and God will help us and heal us. But this is actually speaking in the past. That is, this was someone who was having a hard time, who seemed to have enemies who were lording over him. And then, Aramincha, I extol you, I'm grateful to you, God, for having lifted me up. And you actually didn't ultimately let my enemies rejoice over me. I did cry out, you healed me. And then some sort of metaphoric language. I was down in the dumps. I was, in a personal kind of hell, things were bad, and you lifted me up. Right? So for me, at least, and I think for many people, it's hyperbolic language. In Devarim, we have the language of see then that I am he, I'm God, there is no God beside me. Don't worry about the capital G or not. It wasn't a political statement. I deal death and give life. I wounded and I will heal. None can deliver from my hand. So first of all, amit va'achaya, something we're going to be looking at later. And it should remind you a bit of the Amidah, of the Shemona Esrei that we say. And one can look at this and say, so God is responsible for death. And notice that death is listed first and giving life. For many, or for some, this is some sort of indication that God can sort of bring back to life. For many others, it's just a simple indication that God is the source of life, rather than God brings life to those who are dead, because that's actually not what it says. And again, we have similar language of Meimit Mechayeh from the book of Samuel. And again, the Lord deals out, gives life, casts down the Sheol and raises up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He casts down, he also lifts high. And the rest of it seems to be things that happen in this world and not in another world. And so if this were to be about another world, it actually wouldn't fit in well with the rest of the section. But there is an exception still within the book of Samuel, which we're not going to read through in full because it's pretty long. But Samuel dies, and Shaul is at a loss. He doesn't know what to do. He can't figure out what to do with his enemies, and he's very worried. So he turns to God and looks for help, and God does not help him. So what does he do? He turns to his people and he says, find me a woman who consults ghosts, okay? And so I can go and inquire through her, and she becomes known as the Woman of Endorph. This is a famous chapter in the book of Samuel. So he goes, he disguises himself, because certainly King Saul doesn't want people to know that he's consulting from this woman, partly because it was recently mentioned you're not allowed to do such things. And she asks, please divine for me by a ghost, bring up for me the one I shall name to you. Woman answered him, you know what Shaul has done. He's banned. You're not allowed to do this. It's just a trap. And Shaul says, don't worry about it. And who should I bring up? Okay, I'll do it. Bring up Samuel, who has recently died. Then the woman recognized Samuel. She shrieks at to Shaul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Shaul." She figures it out. "Don't be afraid," he says. Okay. The woman says to Shaul, "I see a divine being coming up from the earth." Okay. She describes him. He's old. He's wearing a robe. That's how Shaul knows it's Samuel, and he bows down. What does Samuel say? "Why have you disturbed me and brought me up?" Like I was sleeping. Like, leave me alone. I was doing something. Shaul answers, "I'm in great trouble. I'm being attacked. So I called you to give me some help, tell me what to do." And Shmuel says, "Why do you ask me, seeing that the Lord has turned away from you and has become your adversary?" Okay, and we can stop there. So what do we take from this story?
I think the idea of resurrection.
Okay, so there's something about coming up from the earth, Elisa. Okay. In some form, although Shaul doesn't see, right? It's just Shmuel who sees. It's just the woman who sees Shmuel.
To me, it sounds like Shaul believed in an afterlife.
Anyone else? Sophie?
I don't know. I feel like leave me, like once we're dead, we shouldn't contact the dead. It's there where they have to be and we're where we should be. And to pull them out is almost a sin, like leave it alone. I don't know.
Anyone else?
We haven't, oh, sorry. We haven't discussed yet anything about Har has 18 and
Stephen, you're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead.
Okay.
So one more thing which I'm noticing about this text is that Shmuel obviously is aware of what is happening between God and Shaul, right? He turns to Shaul and says, like, "Didn't God? You already talked to God about this. Like, I know God already said no, so leave me alone." It was actually just in this past week's Parsha where it says you're not allowed to turn to these type of people, and the Torah talks about them as being women. This chapter has the woman of Endorph obviously being a woman. It was understood that there were men who did this too, but the majority of people who did this kind of work were women. And it's a sin in the Torah. It's clear that Shmuel said you're not allowed to do such a thing. In their time, there is a fear of bridging what perhaps should be the unbridgeable gap between life and death. The fact that this was done through a woman who was doing something illegal means that later sources aren't going to turn to this and say, look, you can do it, because it was all done improperly. Everything about this says, this isn't good, don't do this, leave them alone. It's not a source which encourages us to say we should reach out beyond us, or that we can reach out beyond us. So that's certainly my read of this. Some people have, there are many much later sources say, how is he able to do this? Well, Shmuel just died. This is still within the 11 months. And there is still some sense of him being present in some way. Okay, but that's certainly a later extrapolation of the story.
You're almost getting into women and witchcraft.
Yeah, and that's, women and witchcraft is written all over this, yeah. Okay. Many of us are familiar, and this is a Haftarah that we read during the year, of Ezekiel and the Valley of Bones, right? The Valley of Dry Bones. He said to me, "O mortal, can these bones live again?" Right? And what happens? Dry bones. Thus said the Lord God to these bones, "I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live again. I lay sinews upon you, cover you with flesh, form skin over you. I'll put breath into you, you'll live again. And you shall know that I am the Lord. I prophesied as I've been commanded. And while prophesying, suddenly there was a sound of rattling. The bones came together, bone to matching bone. I looked, there were sinews on them, flesh had grown and skin had formed over them. There's no breath. God says, prophecy to the breath, prophesy, O mortal, say to the breath, do it, do it. The breath entered them, and they came to life and stood up on their feet, a vast multitude, etc., etc. Okay? What do we take from this? Although actually, let me do the last one, last 2 lines. You shall know, my people, that I am the Lord when I've opened your graves and lifted you out of your graves. I'll put my breath into you, and you shall live again. I will set you upon your own soil. Then you shall know that I, the Lord, have spoken and have acted, declares the Lord. Okay. So what do we make of this?
Well, I think that's the idea of the Messiah coming, but it's God coming.
Okay.
The resurrection, you know,
Some form of resurrection.
Yes. But he says, I'm going to put you on your own land or your own ground. So does that mean resurrected to this world or to a different place?
So Ezekiel is a diaspora prophet, and this all seems to be metaphoric language saying God will restore you, the Israelite people, to the land of Israel. So while we could look at this in some ways as, at least I said, messianic and then resurrection, the way that I would read it, if we had more time today, we could spend a whole course just on these few verses, is the prophet is speaking the way prophets speak, and God is channeled through the prophet. That is to say, this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor for national redemption in the land of Israel. Okay, and actually that's the way later sources tend to read this. So Jewish sources, pre-modern era sources, don't seem to read this as saying there's going to be a resurrection, or that Ezekiel actually saw bones getting sinews on them and breathing all of a sudden. This is how prophets speak and see things. Cheryl Cole.
So is this the reason why people want to all be buried in Israel? So when the Mashiach comes, they're in the right place at the right time?
So you were alluding to what Stephen was alluding to. I'll answer because I have sort of 2 questions. There is an idea that when resurrection happens, if you believe in physical resurrection, that it'll happen, or it'll begin, so to speak, in Israel or in Har Zeitim, the Mount of Olives. There's an idea that those who are buried outside the land will have to crawl through tunnels and pop out in Israel, and they don't want to do that. It's going to take time. It'll be uncomfortable. So there's a lot of ideas why people want to be buried in Israel. And then there's the counter idea, which actually I think my mother mentioned to me many, many years ago. If a body is the source, the ultimate source of impurity, why would we ship that to Israel and put it there, right? Why are we adding impurity to the land of Israel? Which was my mother's way of saying, save your money, bury me here. And,
isn't the idea to die in Israel, not to be buried, but to go to Israel and die in Israel?
Sorry, say that again, Lisa?
Isn't it the idea to go to Israel and die in Israel, not to be already dead and shipped there?
I'm not familiar with that as an idea to die in Israel. There's an idea to make live there, and and then we die because we're there.
To die there, like to be in Israel.
But to be in Israel by itself is certainly a mitzvah. To live there, make aliyah. Okay. So I said we had spent a couple minutes just looking at different terms, and again, we're laying the ground for what's to come. So in in source 26, nafesh, and translation here, for the waters have reached my neck. Kivau ma'im ad nafesh, so we have neck here for nafesh. It's clearly not talking about a metaphysical thing, right? If you're talking about waters getting somewhere, the waters are not reaching your soul. That's not a thing that can happen. But they could be reaching your ability to be alive. Nafsho kechalim. Job talks about that nefesh ignites coals. Again, nefesh here seems to be breath, or the life breath, not about something else like a soul. Do nefesh here and here and here. It's the same kind of thing from Leviticus. Here we have nishmator from nishama. If he but intends it, He can call back his spirit and breath. All flesh would at once expire, mankind return it to dust. We could go look at this one in depth. Like Job is a very complicated book. But if God intends it, the speaker means God can give someone the ability to be alive. But it's not in this sense here, it can be taught in context, that God is saying, I'm going to give him back the soul and give him back breath. He's going to pop up again. Nefesh again, ruach, here, breath departing, he returns to dust. On that day, his plans come to nothing. That, your ruach, which some people talk about, your internal spirit, biblically, is it's your breath. And once your breath is gone, or the spark of breath is gone, so too is our ability to live. And we have nishama and nefesh again here. And God blowing he blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being, nefesh chaya. That all these terms in the Bible in that time meant something about the ability to be alive, the spark of life within us. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with 3 texts, and we're going to return to these texts, particularly this first one, Daniel from chapter 12. And this is, I think, this is verse 7, I think. And this is going to come up a few more times, so I want you to really focus on this. And I labeled this title, "And Yet," because here is where we start to see a spark of something else. We'll get into the background, the context of Daniel next time. But just think of Daniel. Daniel's a late book in the Bible, that is to say, in the chronology of the Bible, both in what it's talking about and when it was written, it is very late. So at that time, the great prince, Michael, who stands beside the sons of your people, so at some future time, after certain things are defeated, Michael, this great prince, will appear. It'll be a time of trouble, the like of which has never been seen since the nation came into being. At that time, your people will be rescued, all who are found inscribed in the book. And then many of those that sleep in the dust will awake, some to eternal life, others to, in this case, reproaches to everlasting abhorrence. Okay? So, Ela lechaye olam, right? So, chaye is from chayim, right? Life. Olam is not just world, but it's also a tense forward. It means, forever. And others, Ela lecharot lidir'on olam. The bad things, reproaches, everlasting abhorrences. And the book concludes with a few nice words and says, for these words are secret and sealed to the time of end. Daniel wants to understand this better, and God says, I'm not going to explain this to you anymore. Okay, so I'm going to take a pause there. What does Daniel say? I know I just pulled it through. Maybe I'll just bring it up on the screen again. So the green section. What is here? What does this say about the world to come? I can't see you right now, so someone just has to start talking.
So to me, it seems to say that after death, there's a resurrection, and some are resurrected to eternal life, and some to hell, if you want to call it everlasting abhorrent.
Okay, and why do you say resurrection?
Well, because many of those that sleep in the dust would be those that were dead.
Okay, and so you understand this in terms of and will awake, yakitsu,
Yeah.
as being some sort of physical coming up.
Yes. Well, not necessarily. It could be a spiritual coming up. It could, because eternal life, it's unclear.
Okay. Right. So I agree. If we're reading it from a point of view of today, when we have an idea of soul, then yeah, we could read this as being something which is not physical but a soul. I think the argument I was trying to make earlier is that the Bible doesn't separate soul from body, and so therefore there would have to be some level of physicality to this. So that those who are sleeping, if that's the way we want to understand this, and he doesn't use sleeping, then yakitsu doesn't mean necessarily exactly waking up, it's sort of springing forth. They're going to be there. And Alan, you point something very interesting or very important here. It's some, that is the good people, get the eternal life, and the bad people get what?
Hell.
If that's a term we want to use.
If that's.
They certainly don't talk about heaven and hell. That's not, the terminology yet. And
What we would understand as hell.
Right. What we might understand as hell. And what about most people?
Doesn't really say whether it's most. It's just some, others. It's just some and others.
Yeah, but it doesn't say all people.
Yeah, it doesn't say all people.
That's true. It says many.
Many. Good. Ela and Ela. These people, some people even. But the plain text seems to be that for some people, presumably the very good people, they have something good coming to them, Chaye Olam. And for the bad people, they have something bad coming to them. But for the vast majority of us, there is going to be something which is bad, which is going to be sort of the end. And that's it. The end, the end, the end.
Va'etahi, that at the very beginning of what we were looking at, it was translated at that time or something. Yeah. Va'etahi, at that time. What's that time?
Sorry for the brief timeout. Lynn, would you like to repeat?
Yeah, at the very beginning, it says Uva'etahi, at that time. What is that?
Future.
Time?
It's a future time. So down here, so there's a prophecy about a 400-year period, and then Daniel is talking about what happens after that.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't, in this whole thing with Daniel, I don't see anything about death.
Okay. So how do you interpret many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth?
That's about the only part. I don't know why it's grayed out, but if you take everything, it's sort of he's speaking now, in today.
So it begins with Ba'etahi, and that's time. And then I didn't include all the verses here, and sorry, I didn't make that totally clear. It's my fault. He's giving a prophecy about what's going to happen next few hundred years, and that at that time, when all these prophecies are complete, this thing is going to happen. Rabim miyeshenei admat afar yakitzu. Many of those that sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. I read sleep in the dust of the earth as being those who are dead, but I mean, you can certainly read it another way. It's not grayed out. I put it in green because I wanted you to see it, to stand out. Sorry if it's gray and harder to read for you. Okay. So we're gonna have two more brief sources, and then we're gonna sum up. Both from Isaiah. Oh, let your dead revive, let corpses arise, awake and shout for joy, you who dwell in the dust. For your dew is like the dew on fresh ground, you make the lands of the shades come to life. Finally, he will destroy death forever, that is God. My Lord God will wipe the tears away from all faces and will put an end to the reproach of his people over all the earth. For it is the Lord who has spoken. Okay. So someone want to do a summary of what we learned so far? Going once? Going twice? Anyone? Okay, so for me at least, I think we saw a lot of sources from Tanakh, which seem to indicate that there is actually very little interest, particularly in the Torah, about what happens after we die. They may have been thinking about it back then, but they certainly don't write about it in the Torah. Die and everyone else you get mourned, and then people move on with their lives. Later sources within Tanakh, particularly Psalms, but elsewhere as well, really drive that home about the finality of death, and that's the way it is. that death and dead bodies are something which are impure. We could do a whole study. I just gave you a little bit examples of certain terms which today we might use to indicate soul, particularly neshama or nefesh or ruach, but within their context, in their biblical lingual context, they do not mean what we mean by soul. They mean like the spark of life within us, the life breath, for lack of a better term. But we do have something in Daniel and a couple things from Isaiah. But this thing from Daniel, which we just looked at, which seems to say that a time will come after these prophecies, which he talks about, that the good people will awake and get something chayei olam, and the bad people will also awake to something very bad. And that will be the primary kernel from which the sources which we're going to see in the weeks to come will grow their vegetation, to continue that metaphor, of the world to come. There is no class next week. It is Tanit Esther. It's the fast of Esther. And I didn't want to have a class that day, both for my own well-being, but also because I'm going to give you homework. And I'm going to give you, I want you to work a little bit in small groups. So please send me a message now in the chat if you are not okay with me sharing your email address with 3 or 4 other people, because I'd like to set you up into some very small groups and have you take this time next week, because I know it's available, or if not, some other time next week, and talk about what I'm going to send you in an email. Okay? So send me a chat now if you do not want your email address shared.
How do you send chat?
It's on the bottom of your screen, or you can just email me if you want to.
Bottom
Okay.
of the screen.
Or you can email me. I'll wait for an email. I won't send this out to the groups immediately. I'm literally going to take a picture of my screen because I know most of you who are here. And finally, there won't be a class the week after because we have a very exciting opportunity. We're trying to launch a series. Of some public Jewish figures who are going to teach Torah, and then Jacob, who are going to teach Torah, and then talk about how that might connect into their public life. So we have some time with Yaara Sachs, the Member of Parliament for York Center. That's in 2 weeks. That's 2:30 on March the 4th. And then we'll continue after the week after that. We're not every week, but we're most weeks on Thursday at 2 p.m. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely, lovely week or few weeks.
Thank you.
Before
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
You
you.
have a good